Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to our fifth webinar of the Global Goals Webinar Series. And this is a webinar series organized by the Global Goals Project, Utrecht University, in collaboration with the Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals of the Earth System Governance Project. So my name is Yixian Sun. I'm Assistant Professor in International Development at the University of Bath in the UK. I'm also a co-convener of the Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals of the Earth System Governance Project. So the idea of this webinar series is really to share the key findings of this Sustainable Development Goal Impact Assessment led by the Global Goals Project at Utrecht University. So this assessment started in the second half of 2020. So the idea is to examine the steering effects of Sustainable Development Goals agreed by all countries in the world in 2015, and to see after 7 years, what have been achieved, what are the impacts of the Sustainable Development Goals at different levels, but also the interaction and interplay between different goals, and as well as the methods that we need to assess the impact of these goals. So the assessment has been completed early this year, and it will be published as a book by the Cambridge University Press in March 2022. So before the formal publication of this book, so we'd like to share you with the key findings. And we have started this webinar series earlier this year, and this is already our fifth webinar. And today, the topic is on the global and local inclusiveness of governance arrangement to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So this impact assessment overall was completed by more than 60 authors around the world. So for each chapter, we have lead authors, but also contributing authors. For example, I am one of the contributing authors to the second chapter on the implementation. And today we are very delighted to have two lead authors of this chapter on inclusiveness, Professor Okereke from Nigeria, and Dr. Carole-Anne Sénit from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And we will also have expert on this topic, Dr. Madina Guloba from Uganda, to give us her thoughts about this chapter and the findings that this assessment has generated. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our two presenters to give us a presentation about this chapter. So before I give the floor to them, I'd like to remind everyone, so all participants, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A window during the presentation, while you will not be able to unmute yourself, but you can still ask your questions. And my job here today as a moderator is really to look at what questions will be there, and then I will select some questions. But hopefully, I can also put some questions together and ask all the questions that you will raise during the presentation. Okay, so now let's just get started with the presentations of the two lead authors of this chapter. Okay, so here are some housekeeping rules I think I have already said. So now we can start the presentation. So Chuck, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Z, for the introduction. As the moderator has said, the emphasis on today's presentation is on inclusiveness, and the broader context is the examination of the extent to which the SDG goals that have been set in 2015 has been achieved. I have the pleasure to make the presentation with Carole-Anne, who is coordinating lead author of the chapter, but I also wanted to make sure that I thank all the contributing authors, the lead authors in the chapter, for their excellent work. Now, inclusiveness is a major component and goal of the SDGs. The idea that no one should be left behind is mentioned several times in the document, the SDG document, at least 5 times. But also many of the goals and targets of the 2030 agenda focus on inclusiveness, either directly or indirectly. Goal number 1, which is about poverty alleviation or eradication. Goal number 2, which is about access to food. Goal number 4, which is about education, energy. 7, directly goal 16, which is about justice. I think goal 5 targets the vulnerable group. And I think goal 10 is specifically about inequality. So it is very clear that inclusiveness is a central component of the SDGs. And it has to be so because inequality is a major blight in the world today, both at national and international level. About 735 million people live in extreme poverty. That is less than 1.9 US dollars a day. Many people all over the world lack access to basic rights to food, education, energy. I think in 2019, up to 820 million people, and that's more than 10% of humanity, suffer from food and dietary deprivations. And these inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic, it is recorded, may have pushed up to 100 million people back into poverty after prolonged unemployment. And the World Food Program actually estimates that up to another 130 million people may fall into the category as a result of the pandemic. And we also know that the public spaces for participation and politics have been shrinking progressively. And some have actually written about the decay or disintegration of democratic norms and principles across the world. The central question then becomes, what extent has the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal led to more inclusion between and within countries? Next slide. Now, to be able to really look at this question, we have to first of all conceptualize inclusiveness. At the 1995 World Summit for Social Development, government defined inclusive society as a society for all, in which every individual, each with rights and responsibility, has an active role to play in the society, but also feels a sense of belonging and accommodation. The concept of inclusiveness can sometimes be nebulous, but it is broadly defined in relation to other key concepts such as participation, democratic legitimacy, inclusive development. But for the sake of our work, we zoomed in at 3 components: recognition, participation, and distributive dimensions of inclusiveness. With respect to recognition, we're looking to see the extent to which marginalized people, their rights, their freedom from threats have been recognized. With respect to inclusion, participation, we're looking to see the extent to which marginalized people have been included in the participation, and actually not just in a tokenistic way, but in a way that ensures that they do have what we call voice in political philosophical terms, which is the ability to actually determine how decisions are made. And in terms of distribution, we define inclusion with respect to the extent to which the distribution of the burdens and benefits and risks associated with the politics of the jurisdiction in question are actually distributed in a fair way. Now, we focused on two levels for our analysis and inquiry in the chapter. The first level is at the national level, and the second is at the international or global level. For the national level, we focused on those that are marginalized, and many of these groups have been actually mentioned in the SDG documents themselves. And we are quite clear about the need for an intersectional definition or understanding of inclusiveness, which varies with criteria such as age, class, caste, gender, indigeneity, and race, but also to vulnerability to environmental shocks. And so we're looking to see the extent to which these marginalized people, which also actually includes children and youth, as well as people with disability, indigenous people, migrants, and refugees, this corpus of marginalized groups, to what extent has the implementation of the SDG allowed for their inclusion, again, along those straight lines of recognition, participation, and distribution. Now, for the international level, we have to narrow our focus on the least developed countries. The least developed countries comprises about 46 or so countries that are recognized according to the United Nations classification as the ones that are actually the most underdeveloped. And these groups constitute about 10% of the global population, many of them actually in Africa. And so again, the question here is the extent to which these least developed countries have been included in policy decision makings along the lines of recognition, participation, and distribution. And what we did is to try and focus on the steering effect of the SDG, and to operationalize that. We look at what we call the normative, the institutional, and the discursive changes that have been occasioned or facilitated by the SDG. In terms of the normative, we are interested to see the extent to which SDG goals have changed or influenced norms and policies towards the inclusiveness of vulnerable groups, and at the international level, whether new decisions were taken to better include the least developed countries in the global governance of various issue areas. For the institutional steering effect, we are interested to investigate the extent to which SDGs have prompted the establishment or modification of departments, committees, institutions, offices of programs to promote inclusiveness, or at least reduce power asymmetries and inequality, both at the national level, but also at the international level. And finally, with respect to discursive changes, we are looking to see the extent to which the SDG goals have had a steering effect in the discursive practices of groups, nations, and at the international level. And here we're looking for evidence as to whether the principle of leaving no one behind has been mobilized and used in debates and documents that have been published since 2015, as well as in speeches that are made. Next slide. So in terms of methodology, we had a systematic review of academic literature using various strings that had to do with inclusiveness, democratic legitimacy, inequality, etc. And we focused on published literature between 2015 and 2020 in social science journals. We included 2015 because we realized that even though we're looking for steering effect, the kind of practices in the literature may have had some kind of impact on the way that even the SDG goals have been crafted. So we use such string scopus, 479 hits, screening down up onto 40 articles. And then we included some gray literature because actually the role of the SDGs in steering inclusiveness along those categories that I described to you were not quite widely found in the literature, so we had to augment with gray literature. And Carole-Anne will now share with you some of the findings in the next slides.
Yes, thanks so much, Chucks. I will cover first what has been the impact of the Sustainable Development Goals at the national level on inclusiveness. And I'm sorry to break the news to you, but the SDGs actually have not really significantly steered inclusiveness beyond advancing the discursive recognition of specific vulnerable groups in national policy agendas. Of course, well, the SDGs have been adopted in 2015. There's been a large uptake of the Leave No One Behind principle in the policy discourse, but in spite of this, vulnerable groups are actually still denied equal representation in national policy making. And in many countries, we have seen that the goals increase only the saliency of inclusiveness in existing institutions and policy processes. We found that the SDGs have mainly been leveraged, if at all, as an overarching international framework to legitimize existing national policies and institutions for the promotion of inclusiveness. But the SDGs did not really have effects on additionality, so on really creating new policies or new institutions for inclusiveness. But of course, it's not an entirely dark and negative picture. There are, of course, some positive examples. In some developing countries, the SDGs have steered normative developments towards the inclusion, for instance, of persons with disabilities. The government of Ecuador, for instance, used SDG 10.2, which aims to empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, etc., to prioritize and to legitimize the emphasis on disability in welfare spending. In other countries, SDG implementation has also led to some institutional developments. So for instance, in Iceland, the government is focused on inclusive cooperation in implementing the SDGs, in particular opening political space, for instance, through the Icelandic Youth Council for the SDGs, in which children and youth can express their voice in decision-making. And in Brazil, which is also one of the few countries that created a robust institutional framework to coordinate the creation of national targets and indicators for the SDGs, and to articulate domestic uptake of the goals with the participation of non-state actors through a national commission for the SDGs. So we can see some institutional effects in Brazil, but this commission, this new institution, was later dismantled after President Bolsonaro took office in 2019. So of course, there are some positive examples of steering effects on the development of new norms and new institutions for inclusiveness, but these examples remain scarce. And for some, it is actually doubtful whether any improvement towards inclusiveness in countries is actually causally and directly linked to the SDGs. Related to the international level, again, here at this level, there is actually no evidence that the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 has advanced the inclusiveness and the influence of the world's most vulnerable countries in global governance and in the global economy. So for one, there are actually no indications that the SDGs steered global governance structures towards more inclusiveness, especially regarding the list developed countries. And actually, this is in spite of dedicated target that has been adopted, target 16.8, which like calls for a greater participation of developing countries in global governance structures. And if you look at the voluntary national reviews report that are submitted by countries to report on progress towards the implementation of the SDGs, this specific target has actually never been reported upon. So in the end, studies doubt whether the SDGs will ever be able to transform legal frameworks towards an increased political participation of the poorest countries in global governance. And in addition, with respect to the distributive aspect of inclusiveness, so there has been continued, even since their adoption in 2015, there's been continued lack of compliance with aid commitments to support the least developed countries, such as commitments on aid from the global north. And this actually shows the lack of normative effects of the SDGs on the distributional dimension of inclusiveness, and which is the inability of the SDGs to really trigger support for the LDCs to participate more in the global economy. But one point perhaps which should be mentioned is that there is evidence that emerging economies like China in the global south increasingly frame their aid and their investment commitments to poorer countries as promoting the SDGs, but still it is like from the domain of the discourse. So in some, we find that there's actually a mismatch between rhetoric and action. So between like steering effects on discourses versus steering effects on institutions and norms. We've seen that vulnerable people and countries are indeed perhaps more discursively prioritized in SDG implementation since 2015. But we also found that normative or institutional effects of such discursive prioritization remain limited. And just before I conclude, or actually as a concluding slide, the literature advances possible explanation for the lack of steering effects of the goals on inclusiveness. So first, there are some scholars who argue that the framing of the goals and their embeddedness within a mainstream economic growth approach with actually a dedicated goal on growth only consolidate the conditions through which deprivations and exclusiveness have been sustained and reproduced. There are also some scholars who argue that domestic political contexts explain differences in steering effects on inclusiveness across nations. Studies show that institutional and normative steering fluctuates with changes in government and domestic policies, as we have seen, for instance, in Brazil. And finally, another possible explanation is that it may actually be too soon to definitely state on the steering effects of the SDGs on inclusiveness, because changes often develop over much longer time periods. So an important point also that I want to mention before leaving the floor to Madina, or back to Yishan first, is that the study has actually shown that the impact of the SDGs is not really prominently discussed in the literature yet. Of course, there are many studies on inclusiveness, but there are not so many studies that link inclusiveness with the implementation of the SDGs. So this calls for more research on this topic. And this is a line of research that we want to develop further within the Earth System Governance Taskforce on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I invite you to join. Well, this future research could include, for instance, systemic studies of voluntary national review reports to determine the steering effects of the SDGs on the policy strategies related to inclusion. So I can only invite you to join our network, join our task force, and participate with us to the further development of this line of research. I thank you very much for your attention. And if you want to stay informed of our latest research, you can follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chucks and Carole-Anne, for your very insightful presentation. And now we know what are the key findings from the chapter of this assessment. And we are also very honored today to have Dr. Madina Guloba from the Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda and to give us some feedback, because you were not part of this assessment, but now it's our great pleasure to hear what are your thoughts on this research. So the floor is yours, but before I give you the floor, I want to remind all participants, please type your questions in the Q&A window, and I'll look at your questions, and then later we will have time to invite our speakers to answer your questions. And if you wish to address specific speakers, you can also type their name and then your question. Okay, now the floor is yours, Madina.
Thank you, San, and thank you, Carol, and Chuck, for such a wonderful piece of work. You know, actually, when I was reading this, I said, what do I need to do in this to make a difference? Because it seems everything had been touched. I can assure the audience who have not yet had a chance to read the chapter, that's very rich. The search engines have been really extensive, and the critique really right to the point. And within the issue of whether we have attained inclusiveness or not inclusiveness. And within these far areas, which as Chuck had mentioned, the women and girls, I think children and the youth, the persons with disabilities, we actually usually forget this kind of persons, even in planning at home. We usually lump them in terms of vulnerabilities, you know? So then the migrants and the indigenous people. So actually I was asking someone today, do we really have indigenous people in Uganda? And he said, yeah, we do have them. So you can see the kind of knowledge that some of these issues in terms of inclusions are really critical. So the methodology has been very robust in synthesizing this kind of information for those who are listening in. So as we're looking at marginalization, as looking at it in the broad sense even of social norms, and how these definitions shape society, I was thinking as we go ahead, you know, you looked at the three broad categories of inclusion, but in terms of representation, I think distribution and recognition. But I think one thing we need to think about is the moment recognized, so what? You know, what do we need to do about this recognition before we jump to representation? So most of the time we need SDGs, I think, to also look out for the aspect of the reduction. How best are they reducing the situations at the status quo? How are they responding to the situations now? Before we move into the aspects of either, what do I call representation and distribution? Because recognition, if there's no reduction to recognizing it, then there's something missing in between. So I was thinking this is something we need as we are going into the next phases. How do we consider even these aspects of this? You see, now we recognize that population growth is a critical element for inclusion, you know, this is an example, and the quality of it. So how best are we doing about reducing it or improving it? So that's the reduction bit of it. Then how do we present this kind of population within the economic realm, within the economies we are presenting? So these are, when I was reading this chapter, I realized there's a lot to do, you know, digging deeper, you know, and in terms of the SDG evaluation and its limitations. in terms of the country heterogeneities we face today, in terms of its limitations in either countries have to go back down and translate some of these SDGs that are there to what they see as priorities. So within the priorities, what's the priority for our own economies? You find that now the question is, if I'm meeting this SDG, is for who? So you find some of us will have the question of, if these SDGs are not met, so what? What will you do to me? You know, those are the questions you do. Where's there's too much complacency, where it's recognized and it's put on paper. And then if I don't meet that SDG beyond the 2030, what would be the carrot or the stick here in this sense? So if I've not attained inclusion, what will you do? I don't see that within the SDG, the agenda themselves, in terms of fostering these economies to attain actually these inclusion kind of indicators that are there. So we have to seek for systematic issues and sequential ways of addressing some of these indicators going forward. So then when I read into the aspects, you know, the authors really dug into the issues of how we do what they call strategic behavior in terms of actions on ground. So when we mention even this aspect of distribution using the aid, you know, when we economies, when we look through the SDGs, sometimes we feel like, of course, they're developed for developing countries to make sure they measure their progress towards something, you know. But now, towards that, we look at the strategic behavior of these economies in meeting these SDG goals vis-a-vis the actual agenda within these economies. So at the end of the day, you find, let me say, like Uganda, we have these SDGs and we put them, yes, in our NDP plans. But beyond this, and for making sure we comply to the UN agenda, what is in it in terms of strategic behavior to make sure we meet it for our people, in terms of actions, in terms of making sure this inclusion, in terms of this young child who has been born with a certain, let me say, autism, is included in the decision-making processes going forward. So the political economy is very critical, and the paper does point to that, ladies and gentlemen. But the political economy, in terms of delivery, should also be consonant on the fact that there's a political economy beyond the domestic political economy. There's also the political economy of aid provision from the external side to meet the agenda of the SDG inclusion. What can I say here? So most of the time, if like now what the COVID-19 has presented itself to us, that as we're trying to do these SDGs, probably the pandemic did not come into play in terms of how it's going to affect the aid flows in meeting these SDG agendas for these developing countries right now we are seeing. So because of that, we see strategic behavior or lack of behavior of even the donor commitments and the disbursements to these economies to meeting these SDG indicators on inclusion. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, this issue of, if I don't meet it, what will you do? Because I don't have the budget for it anyway. It stopped coming. So we need to think through some of these things as even countries prioritize. So if my aid budget was meant to increase access to education and stopped, if the economy really went ahead to use its own budget to continue doing roads, which are not necessarily directly inclusive, but they can provide inclusion, what will be the implication at the end of the day in case I don't meet them? So as I conclude, I know we are bad on also on time. We need to think through about heterogeneities within these economies as we meet the priorities of the SDGs in terms of focus on the vulnerable groups. And the focus on vulnerable groups has also made the vulnerable group definition a bit limiting. We have the precarious vulnerable groups. I'm not vulnerable right now, but if you do the income measurement of poverty, as some of the issues are, the biggest majority of these vulnerable groups are not actually the poor. They're those who are floating poor. They're somewhere in there. You're floating today, are educated today, tomorrow, there's no job. So for us, what we are having now is even parents are discouraging their children to go to school. Why? Because they're seeing these children who have gone to school without jobs. So the end point is, why are you going to school when there is no job for you anyway? So we need to see this mindset. What's the kind of mindset around meeting some of the indicators we have for inclusion despite the fact that we are actually advocating for them. So to end this, what I can say is the need for data is critical, and the paper does point out to that. The need for data, which is authentic data to monitor this, the need for to remove the complacency of meeting the SDG goals. Either we put in the stick bit of it. I don't know, we have so many carrots that also can apply the sticks, but what is it need for an economy that does not meet these SDG indicators for inclusion? What is it going to imply for them? So what does it mean for an economy that's not also actually meeting into the East agenda for external provision beyond the domestic policies or the political economy question, domestic and external political question that comes in meeting the agenda of the SDG inclusion agenda? So what I can see, those are some of the questions I probably can think through, San, in terms of the strategic behavior we can have on all sides. But I do thank the authors, Chuck and Carol, really did a good job in terms of really digging out a lot of literature, which is almost non-existent, but we really found some and this issue around the SDG. But we need more rigor. I think what is missing is the rigor of it because of lack of comprehensive data in some of these economies to pick out some of these issues on progress that has been made. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Carol, and thank you, San, for giving me this chance to give some bit of thoughts on this wonderful piece of work.
Thank you, Madina. Thank you for your thought-provoking comments. I think you raised a lot of important questions, and given the time we have, but I just want to give the floor back to the presenters and then maybe invite Chuck and Carole-Anne to quickly reflect on the key points that raised by that Madina have raised, and maybe you want to say a few words. Then I already see some questions in the Q&A box, but I also invite our participant to provide more questions. Then we can have more conversation. So I'll give the floor back to Chuck and Carole-Anne.
Carole, feel free to go first.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, well, I just want to thank you, Madina. I'm not sure I cannot see you anymore. Oh,
sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to read the chapter and also for providing comments. And I just want to say that, yeah, of course, I couldn't agree more with you and with everything that you said. Of course, I mean, one of the explanations could be like what I talked about in the last slide about possible explanations for the lack of steering effects on inclusiveness is perhaps that it is like these effects are not reported because there is indeed a lack of data to report on the specific indicators that relate to the inclusiveness of vulnerable groups and vulnerable countries. So within SDG 10, of course, but also within SDG 5 and SDG 16. So there's indeed a need for, and particularly for developing countries to strengthen their national statistical system, and yes, there are partnerships going on and initiatives with the United Nations for developing countries to be able to to develop further their statistical system and to provide this data that is lacking. Yeah, and again, I agree with you that, of course, another possible explanation for the lack of steering effects of the SDGs on inclusiveness is that in the end, the future, no, sorry, not the future we want, but the outcome agreement of the SDGs, so transforming our world, is just, it's a non-legally binding agreement. And so there are no compliance mechanism. There are no really accountability mechanisms for states to comply to this agreement. And of course, there's a lot of leeway also for states to develop and to translate this international agreement into its national policies. So yes, of course, this is also something that could explain our observation about the lack of steering effects. Well, on the importance of the political economy, of course, political economy is very critical, and as I explained in the presentation, the impact, the political impact of the SDGs is eventually bound by domestic politics, right? So it is, it fluctuates with changes in government, and this makes it also difficult to assess sustainability within the political impact of the SDGs. And I think do you want to add something, Chucks?
I would like to certainly thank Madina for the insightful discussion that she provided, and just basically to agree with her a lot of the points that she made. But I think the chapter does hint at quite a lot of those, even though we haven't had time maybe to explore in detail. That you cannot remove the issue of power dynamics, political economic structures, in understanding the extent to which inclusiveness have not had traction, or the sort of steering effect that one may wish to see at this level. The international community, the global structure, continues to be characterized by huge inequalities, in part because of our commitment to the liberal economic philosophy, but also the legacies of colonialism and neocolonial structures continue to characterize some of the workings of the deep international structural systems. And so on the one hand, we have this kind of rhetorical commitment to inclusion, but on the other hand, the practical workings of the international system continues to hinder any radical transformative agenda in that regard. And we have indicated, and I think Carole-Anne did, point to this kind of conundrum, but also the paradoxical situation we see with, on the one hand, the rich countries saying, yeah, we need to eliminate poverty, but also cutting their ODA. This is kind of very, very interesting. And we also have many, many more examples. In Africa, for example, it's not going to take a lot of effort to, for example, close the loophole that allows about 7.4 billion US dollars to move from Africa to Europe and the West in terms of illicit finances, but also nearly 7.1 billion in terms of legal repatriations to multinational companies. But why these sort of loopholes have not been closed resides, or their understanding of why resides in understanding of the way that the political structures have been working. And I have read some research that shows that for every $1 Africa gets in terms of ODA, Africa gives back the West about $11 through this source of illicit and hopelessly unequal terms of trade. So that's central to understanding. But as Madina was also saying, we cannot put all the blame on criticism on those, because at the national level, there are also quite some kind of political economic forces also that is making it quite difficult to include. the marginalized people. And there is a point that was made by somebody on the chat about the correlation. And I think, yes, there is a hazard, methodological hazard, but we've tried to kind of steer around that by talking about steering effect as opposed to some kind of direct correlation. Because for every improvement that we see along these lines, there may well be multiple forces or other forces in addition to the SDG goal that could actually help to explain some of those. But I think nonetheless that one can still talk credibly about the role of the SDGs, where direct references are made in papers, in discussion, in policy statements, as the reason why governments are trying to include marginalized people. But as Carole-Anne has said, there aren't many of those outside of rhetorics. So I think that the research stands on a solid ground in that respect, but one needs to be clear that the situation can be complex in many ways.
Okay, thank you very much, Carole and Chucks. I think there have been already quite a few questions in the Q&A box, and I saw Chucks, you already responded to some of them. So now let me just pick up one that has not been responded yet. It's about the tensions between the urgency and inclusiveness. I think this is a question from Montserrat Colofan, and she referred to the focus of this year in the climate conference about the urgency. And so I think, according to him, this emphasis on urgencies poses a risk to the inclusion aspect, with the excuse that there is no time left to focus on inclusion issue. So I think the question, so I think I would like to ask this question to our panelists. So how should this trap be avoided? Yeah, maybe you can give some thoughts on this.
Yeah. So clearly is a very valid question, and we see that happening with respect to climate change. On the one hand, vulnerable people or poor people, marginalized people are the most vulnerable to climate change. And there is a sense that greater urgency and ambition is required to protect them from precarity and vulnerability. On the other hand, there is a sense that if you move too fast in terms of curbing carbon emission, you may also endanger the pursuit of livelihood for millions of people. And you see this tension characterizing international climate negotiation. I have published a blog where I actually highlighted this by saying that whilst I am a firm believer on the need for net zero carbon globally as soon as possible, but that net zero carbon has to also go with net zero hunger or net zero poverty, and that you can't trade off one for the other. They have to go together. The way to try and avoid this is actually by looking at some of the fundamentals of inclusiveness. The part of the challenge is that in terms of voice, poor countries and people are not often effectively represented in or around the decision-making tables where critical decisions are taken about how to tackle global challenges, such as climate change, biological diversity, etc., etc. It would seem to me that if they are effectively recognized, but also given the voice that they need to participate effectively, we could actually come to a better understanding of the distributive tools and instruments that will help to share the burdens and benefits of the cooperation a bit more effectively. Do not forget, for example, that the rich countries spent about $13 trillion in their COVID recovery. And most of that was borrowed at zero financial interest rate. Poor countries were not able to access such levels of finance. And many of them continue to borrow at a strangulating interest rate. So there is still something, like Madina was saying, about the fundamentals of the global economic system that continues to work against the marginalized people, the poor people, and continues to perpetuate and reproduce inequality. So it is not that intellectually we cannot reconcile the need for urgency and the need for attending to the needs of the vulnerable people. But the challenge is that to do so requires some kind of transformative conceptions of justice, which will push against the status quo and the established political economic norms that have continued to profit those that have power.
Thanks a lot, Chucks. Carole-Anne, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts on this. Yes, of course. I mean, this is a normative tension that has been discussed for quite some time in the literature, and yeah, which relates to the tension between inclusiveness and effectiveness, right, of policies related to climate change, to sustainability more broadly. But perhaps, I mean, how should this trap be avoided? Then I think that it is still important to really include vulnerable groups, because I mean, just for a normative reason, which is that of the greater acceptability of policies. If you do not include these groups within policy making, within decision making, then yeah, you end up with policy backlash once the policy is accepted and implemented, such as we have seen, for instance, in Australia with the carbon tax, or even in France with the Yellow Vest movement. So I think that this normative reason of policy acceptance, policy acceptability, should be the one that we should focus on. Yeah, and I think that's it.
Okay, good. I think yeah, I think we don't have a lot of time, but we still have a few questions. So I really want to ask all the questions we have now. I think I saw another question from Nava Nails, quite specific here about the findings. I think he asked, do these findings provide any guidance for managing trade-offs between international inclusion and the unintended consequences of international aid or governance opportunities, such as compensating for bad policies in developing countries or providing legitimacy for despotic regimes? I think this is also quite interesting question. So would some of our panelists want to address this? I think we talk about this interplay between international inclusiveness and domestic policy. I think this one directly addressed that dynamic interaction. So I would like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this, yeah, I guess this speaks to perhaps the conditionality of aid, right? But to be honest, I wouldn't know how to answer this question. Yeah, I don't have specific expertise on this topic of the conditionality.
I might be able to offer some thoughts.
Thanks.
First of all, when it comes to remember that we talked about inclusiveness as intersected various other political philosophical constructs such as legitimacy and justice. So I think it is actually a logical non sequitur to say that you will condition the aid that you give me on certain things that I have to do to receive that aid, if the aid is based or grounded on the norms of justice. If you owe me, you should pay me what you owe me. You don't have to tell me what to do before you give me back the money that you stole from me, for example. Okay, so at the normative, deep normative level, the question of how developing countries use the money that have been written in international legal terms as what they are owed, or the commitments that have been made, is actually for me a cop-out. Okay, So if there is a promise, for example, in the terms of climate change of $100 billion, you first of all have to put the money on the table before you begin to talk about any form of condition, all right? But at the moment, the money is not there. So the reference to conditionality, I think, is a distraction. But suppose the money is there, I don't think that it is difficult to actually work with poor countries or to establish ways in which we can enhance transparency, accountability of use. Because in any case, this is part of the existing ODI regime. Most African countries that I work very closely with, they have a huge amount of conditionalities attached to the money they receive here anyway. So yes, there could be more ways of enhancing this. And actually, I think that inclusion can help to make that happen. If we say, as Madina was talking about, that this aid or this money is conditional, or that the involvement of certain kinds of people with disability, women and group, they have to be involved in the decision-making of how this money is used, then you are actually marrying inclusion with effectiveness. So I reject the suggestion that there is fundamentally a moral irreconcilability between, for example, urgency and inclusiveness, because I think that actually inclusiveness can help to advance the causes of effectiveness and urgency. What the problem rather is, as I indicated, the political economy of power. Those who are holding the power at national and international level will resist the fundamental changes required to make this happen.
Thanks very much, Chuck. And this is, I think, I don't see any better answers than this one. But now I think we are about the end of this webinar, but as we actually also got some questions from live stream. So I hope we can quickly address this question I'd like to ask. It's about the accountability mechanism. I think some people in our audience ask about, do we see any developments in these areas in terms of accountability mechanism for inclusivity of vulnerable communities? Or I would like to ask our panelists, or if not, maybe you could share some of your reflections or your predictions in this area.
The point we seek to make in the paper, because remember that, as Carole-Anne was saying, we're checking for inclusiveness at 3 levels, steering effect at 3 levels: the normative dimension, the institutional dimension, and the discursive dimension. So the question actually strikes at the institutional dimension. And the point we're making is that if the international community, as well as people that hold power at the national level, are serious in enhancing inclusiveness, then there has to be some kind of institutional mechanisms to help to promote transparency and legitimacy. At the moment, our research finds that this is not happening to the degree that we can celebrate, that there is not enough of this happening. There are a little bit of practices here and there. For example, in South Korea, with respect to climate change, we have now a very massive public stakeholder groups that has made it conscious to include people with disability and youth. Nigeria has recently just signed a climate change law that establishes a national council on climate change, and that law mandates the government to include people with disability, women, youth, as part of the governance arrangement. The Presidential Council of Climate Change in South Africa also makes explicit provision for marginalized people to be included. But go back to the question about methodological correlation. You cannot, in my view, rigorously assert that all of this is because of SDG. But insofar as these things are intended to achieve SDG 13, you can actually say, well, that there's a steering effect there. So there is need for more research in this area, and we welcome you guys to join the research group so that we can advance research in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. And just to add, I think that one way forward on this could be, like to institutionalize participatory mechanisms, to institutionalize participation of vulnerable groups in the development of voluntary national reviews report. So really, develop participatory mechanisms for these groups to also provide inputs to this report on progress on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Carole-Anne, and also many thanks, Madina, I think, for giving us this very thought-provoking conversation. I think we are already running out of time, so I think I'd like to close this webinar. But before that, let me just announce our next webinar. That will be in January next year. I think we haven't decided the date yet, but we will announce soon. So this will be about the chapter on the planetary integrity. And we will have 2 lead authors of this chapter, Louis Kotti from Northwest University in South Africa and Rakim from Utrecht University, the Netherlands. And before I finish, I would like to also invite everyone to join our group. As you know, even if you are not part of this assessment, we will continue this area of research. So please follow us on Twitter. So here there are 2 handles, one on Global Goals Project, but the other is our Earth System Governance Taskforce on Sustainable Development Goals. So please get in touch, and hopefully, we can do more research together. Thank you very much, and hope to see everyone in January.
Thank you, San. Thank you, Carol and Chuck.
Thank you. Thank you, Madina. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Yishin, for the moderation. Bye-bye.
Bye.